Hi everyone and welcome to a new video on the CBI channel. In this tutorial series we're creating a calendar on our Django and React application by using FullCalendar. This is not the first video in this series. In fact, we've already done 8 before, in which we've completed a basic setup. We've explored different FullCalendar views and displayed database data on our calendar. We've given event different colors and enabled different options for filtering the events on the calendar. And we've also added links. Now, in this video and also in the previous video, we're going to be focusing on clicking specific days in our calendar and then making sure that we can add events on our calendar by entering some information in the forms. Now, in the previous video, we've already solved half of the problem. And now if we go to our calendar and we click on a specific day, a model will pop up that is going to state that we have selected a certain day. Now in this video, we are going to continue and we're going to make sure that we can add forms in this model and then submit it so that events are being created on our calendar. Now to realize that, we're going to be following 6 steps. We're going to start by making a change to our backend so that we're also able to use the API to create events. Next, we're going to be adding some material UI forms to our application, and we're going to display some forms from Material UI on our model so that we have a nice looking form for creating events. Then we're going to make sure that we can control the form values from our calendar page and then use that data to make a submission with Axios to our backend. And that should enable us to create events just by doing a simple click on our calendar. So let's get started. And the first step is actually making a change to our Django backend so that we can create events by using the API we've already created. Now you can see inside of our view.py file that we have a view set that allows us to list records and to retrieve some records from our database. And the list function makes sure that we have a list of all of our objects, and our retrieve function is what we use to display the details page, because this retrieves a single record. Now, if we go to the view set documentation, you can see that there are a lot more classes that you can add to do different things. And the one that we need to add right here is the def create, because that is going to enable us to use the same view set and URL to create records when we make a post request. So inside of this appointment view set, we're going to add another def, and we're going to call it create. And that create is going to take in the arguments of self and request, which is going to be the same as list. Then we do a colon and similarly as above. And then we start by defining the serializer. And the serializer is going to be equal to self.serializer underscore class. And in there, we can state that data is going to be equal to request.data. Because the data that we want to put through this serializer is actually the data that is submitted to the serializer. Then we want to see if the data that we submitted is actually valid. So we're going to do if serializer.is underscore valid. And if that is the case, we want to do serializer.save. And this is going to take the data and store it in the model that we have defined in our serializer. And you can see right here that it's going to then store it in the appointments model. Now, after we have saved the data in our model, we also want to return a response to make sure that they know that everything is okay. And that response is going to be serializer.data. Then we also want to add an else statement, because if the serializer is not valid, we also want our application to know. So then we're going to return the response and say serializer.errors and a status equal to 400. And let's save this. Now what this will do is that if we have a serializer that is valid, it's going to save the data and then return the response with the data saying everything is okay. If the serializer is not valid, it's going to throw us an error, so we know that something is up. Now this is actually all that we need to do, because the router immediately creates a route for creating these appointments, and our serializer has already been created. So if we now start our backend server, and I see that it is already started right here, and we go to the browser and we go to our appointment route, so we click the appointment link right here, you can now see that we also have a form right here with which we can actually submit some data. And this shows that it's going to expect a start date, class names, because that's what we named the status, an end date, and then the title. So in here, we can test if this now works by creating an example record. Let's say that it starts on the 25th of June and it's going to also end on the 25th of June. And the status is going to be equal to completed. And the title is going to be test appointment. And if we now post this, you can see that we get a status of OK, and it returns us the data that has just been added. So what we now need to do is replicate this in a frontend and make sure that we use the Axios request to send the data in this exact format to this link. And then we should be able to create events from our frontend. Now, to make sure that the user can actually enter data in a form, we need to have forms on our application. And we're going to be going to Material UI to select a few forms that we would like to have in our app. And you can see right here in the form section that we have in our backend that we will require 2 date pickers to make sure that we have a start and an end date that we can put in here. So we need to select at least 1 date picker form and put it inside of our application. Then the class names one should actually be a select form where the user can select 1 status, either being open, completed, or in progress. And then the title can be a free text form. So let's go to the documentation and select those and add them to our application. So we are now on the documentation page for Material UI. And when we click Get Started and go to the left-hand side, we can see the components. Now, for the title, we want to get a text field. So we can simply go on the left-hand side to the category of text field. And in here, you can see that we have several options that we can pick. And we're just going to go for this one right here with an outlined text field. So for this example here, I'm going to expand the code and make sure that it's on JavaScript, and then copy over the entire code that is on there. And then we're going to go back to our project and we're going to go to the front-end folder to source. Then we already have a components folder with some forms. And in here, because we already have a date picker form and a multi-select form to do all of the filtering, but I'm just going to add a new folder called create forms. And then we can add a new file, which is going to be called my textform.jsx. And then we just paste in the example from Material UI. Now in here, it has the 3 examples. But we're only looking for the first one, which is the outlined example that we can see right there. So immediately we can get rid of these 2 right there. And we can even go a step further because this styling inside of this box, I actually also don't really need. So I'm going to get rid of that as well. And to make sure that our text field is surrounded by something, I'm going to add some of these tags right here and place our text field inside of it. In case we ever decide to add more components in our return statement. And now we can just format this a little bit by saying that the ID, the label, and the variant are like this. And then I'm going to do one thing inside here. I'm going to add a parameter called full width to this text field. And that's just going to make sure that it's going to be the full width. Now let's also then get rid of the box because we don't need it as an import. And just like that, we are done. Now, the second field that we need is a select field. So we're going to go to select right here and see what kind of examples Material UI has for us. And again, here, the basic example is enough for us. So I'm just going to expand the code again, copy over everything that is in here. And in the same location, I'm going to add a file, but then call it my selectform.jsx and paste the code right here. Now, what I mentioned before is that we want to have the values of open, in progress, and completed. So in this example, I'm just going to hard code it as open and then also change the value to open. And then do the same for this, which is going to be in progress. And same thing goes for the value. That should also be equal to the text value of in progress. And then the last one is going to be completed, which is then also going to be the value in the menu item. And that is all that we need to change for now. Later on, we will make a few other changes, but for now, this is all good. Last thing that we need is a date picker. And we're actually not going to find that in this component list right here, but we will need to go to this drop down in Material UI. And then we can go to Material UI X, where we have the date and the time pickers. And then if we go down to the components, you can see that we have date components and then a date picker. And over there, we find this basic date picker that we've also used before to filter out the records in our calendar. And we're going to expand the code and copy over everything that is in there. And then we're going to go and create a new file called my date picker form.jsx. And then paste this in right here. Now, a few things that we want to change here. Next to the label, I'm also going to add a little bit of styling. And we do that by specifying SX and an equal sign and then two of these square brackets. And in here, I'm going to define that the width needs to be equal to 100%. So that is going to be the same width as the other components that we have selected. I'm also going to say that the input format is going to be a specific date type. And there's going to be day / month / year, because I want our data to be in this format. Then as a last thing, similarly as what we did in this date picker form right here, we're going to copy over the import DJS locale NL because we want it to reflect the Dutch time zones in my case. So I'm going to import that right here. And then similarly as here, I'm going to copy over the adapter locale and change that one to NL so that I have that in there as well. And then as the last thing, I'm going to be calling this my date picker form like this. And let's also change the titles of the other ones because this is going to be my select form. And then this is going to be my text form. Now, as a next step, we can actually put these on our model and see what that is going to look like. So I'm going to go over to the utils folder and go to the modal.jsx file. And in there, we can start by doing a few imports. So we're going to be importing all of our forms, which is going to be my date picker form. We're also going to be importing my select form. And then as the last one, we are going to import my text form. And then we're going to put them in the return statement where we now have, in the next video, I will add the forms here. So inside of this part right here in the typography, we're going to start by defining a few form tags because we're going to define some forms. Then I'm going to place each of the forms within a box because I want to also apply a little bit of styling on them. So in this first box, we're just going to apply SX is, and then these square brackets right here. And I'm going to state that the margin bottom can be equal to 20 pixels to give it a little bit of space. Now in here, the first thing that we want to do is get my text form. And this text form should provide us with the information of the title. Then we can copy over this box right here and paste it in again, but then we want to have my select form. And in the last two boxes, so let's paste it over twice, we want to have our date picker forms. So we can do my date picker form and then again my date picker form. Now, the last thing that we will also need is a submit button. So let's go to the Material UI documentation again, and then go to components and then to button. And in here, I want to have a contain button. So I'm going to expand this code and copy over everything. And inside of the create forms folder, we can add a new file called my button.jsx. And paste in the code of the buttons. Now, I only am interested in the button that is contained like this. So let's have it in right here and say that this one is equal to my button. Okay, now in the model that we have, we can import my button as well. And then on the bottom, add another box, which is going to state my button. So let's save this and see what it now looks like inside of our front end. So we are now in our front end, and when I now click a date, you can see that it pops up and we have 4 forms that enables the user to put in the information that they want. Now, a few things that I don't like with our current configuration is that the labels that are being displayed right here do not indicate what I want. So we need to add a few parameters to make sure that the labels reflect our information. And in addition to that, we're going to be changing the way that changes to these forms are being handled, and that we can actually control the value inside of these forms from our calendar page, because that is going to be required to actually submit the data. So that means that inside of our code, we are going to be adding a few parameters. And the parameters in each of our forms are going to be similar. So inside of my text form on the top in the function, I'm going to add some square brackets, and we're going to be defining a label. We're going to defining the value, the name of the form, and then also an on change. Because these are the things that we want to change in the forms that we currently have to our disposal. Now, label is going to be equal to the label parameter. And this means that we can now change the label from the actual destination of where this form is being used. Then we're going to be adding a few parameters that are going to pass in the value, the name, and the on change. So in here we say value is equal to value. On change is going to be equal to on change. And name is going to be equal to name. And later on, I will show you exactly what this is and how it's going to work. Now we need to apply the same changes to the other forms. So what we can do right here is just copy over value, on change, and name. And then we can go to our select form and put in the exact same thing in the category of select. And then let's just make sure that value is actually equal to value instead of age. And that on change is actually equal to on change. And for label, we need to put in label right there. And then of course, we also need to copy over these parameters that we have and paste them inside of our select form. And for now, we can also delete the constant age and the handle change, because we're going to be redefining that in a minute. And let's save that. Now for our date picker form, it is going to be the exact same story as before. So we're just going to copy over these names, which actually need to be between square brackets. So we're going to be copying over this full thing and add it to our date picker form like this. And then we can also copy over the value, on change, name, and label, and then put it in our date picker form. And then we just need to make sure that label here is also deleted so we don't have it there twice. Now we actually also want to make this button reusable. So we're also going to be adding a label to our button. And we're also going to add a parameter called type to our button, because buttons can have different types. And the label is going to be replacing this piece of text here so that we can indicate what the text in the button needs to be from our page. And then we can also say that we want to define the type of our button by using the type parameter like this. Now let's show what these parameters actually do by going back to our model. So what we can now do for each of these forms is we can define what the value of these parameters should be. So for example, if I say label in my text form, I can say that the label name of this field should be equal to title, because I want to have it as the title of the appointment. Then I can also give this form a name, and this is kind of the technical name that we will be using when we submit the data. And in here, I can also say that this is going to be equal to title. Now for the value and the on change mechanism, we're going to be making some changes shortly. So I'm going to leave those for now, but let's just give everything a label and a name so that we have a little bit more consistency across our forms. So in our select form, we actually want to know the status of the appointment, but the name of the select form is going to be equal to class names, because that's also the technical name that we expect in our backend. Then we can do the same thing for our date picker form. And there we are going to be looking for a start date from our users. So we can say start date. And the technical name is start. And then we can copy this over and also do it for our date picker form right here. And that's going to state the end date that we have. And that technical name is end. And then for the button, we can say that the text inside of the button, which is the label, needs to be equal to submit. And the type of the button, we're also going to be defining as submit, but then lowercase, so that our form knows that this is going to be the button that can submit the data. Now let's take a look in our front end what this looks like. And let's also save our select form. So now when I open one of the days, let's say the 3rd of June, you can see that the labels are now correctly represented in our forms because we have a title that we can have right here. And we have a start date and an end date that we can fill in right there. Now, the next thing that we want to do is when we make a change in the form values, that it is being reflected in a constant, because then we can use that constant to actually submit the data. So what we will now be doing is going to our calendar 9 page. And in there, we're going to be defining the constant that is going to have all of our data. So on the top of this screen of calendar 9, I'm going to define a new constant. And this constant is going to be called form data. And then to change the form data, we have set form data. Now, this is going to be equal to use state, similarly as what we've done before. But now we're going to do some round brackets and then some squarely brackets. And in here, we're actually going to define the data that we want to pass to our backend. And if you see in our API, we want to pass it like start, class names, title, and end. Those are the 4 names that we want to display in the end. So what we will be doing right here is define title and then set the value to nothing for the moment. We also want to do class names and similarly set it to nothing. And the same goes for start and then also for end. Now, what we can then do is make sure that the value of our forms is actually being set to form data, because we need to couple our forms to this constant so that we can actually submit it to the backend. Now, to do that, we actually need to pass the form data constant to our model, because these are in 2 completely different files. So what we can do in our model is say that we expect a parameter called form data. And then in our calendar 9, we can go to our model and say that form data is going to be equal to form data. So now we are passing the value in the constants that we have in our calendar back to our model. And now in our model, we can define that the value of the text form is actually going to be equal to form data.title. And that is going to refer back to what we have in calendar 9 and set right here. And it's all going to make sense very soon why we do it that way. So then we can also do this for the other ones, where the value of the select form is going to be equal to form data.class names. And the value of our date picker form is going to be form data.start. And for the other one is going to be form data.end. Now, what we will notice when we go to our front end is that we get an error, but also that we cannot actually type anything because the way that we manipulate the value has not been defined. We have no mechanism that is going to say that the value should not be empty. So what we now need to do is make sure that we have a new handle change logic that is going to tell the forms how to behave when I type in something new. And what that technically should do is in calendar 9, every time our form changes, it needs to take a look at that form, get the data, and put it in the form data constant by using set form data. Because that way we actually have the latest values available every time. So what we can do in our calendar 9 page, we can create a new constant called handle change. And we're then going to open some round brackets and mention an E because that's what we're going to call in our data. And then we do an arrow function and some squarely brackets. And in there, we need to say what needs to happen. Now you can see inside of the form data right here that we're constantly looking for a name and then for a value. So what we're going to say is that we want to also write that in the form data one. So we say constant is equal to name and then value, and that's going to be equal to e dot target. Then we can say that we want to do set the form data and then do some round brackets and some square brackets, but we only want to set the form data for the name and the value that we are receiving. Because if I change something in my title form, then I don't want to be making changes to our start form. So in here, we're actually going to define dot 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 form data, which means that all of the form data can stay exactly the way that it was, except for the name and then the value that we have received in our handle change. Now, once we link this to our forms, it is going to be taking a look at our form name and our form value. And based on the name, it is going to copy over the value and put it in the constant. So let's say that we change something in our end date, then it's going to look for the value called end, which we have on the top right here, and override the value. But because of the dot form data, it's going to leave the other fields alone. Now, the thing that we now need to do is pass the handle change back to our model again, and then put it to our form. So we can do a comma and say that we also expect the handle change parameter from my model. And then in our calendar, state that in my model, we're going to be passing the handle change with handle change. And this is going to make sure that the logic that we have defined in our calendar page is actually going to be brought to our model 9. Now what we can do in here is actually set the form on change equal to the handle change, which means that the form is then going to be taking into account the process for making changes to the forms. So we can apply that everywhere right here. And now what it should actually do for all of these forms is whenever we change something, it should take the name and the value and put the correct information in the form data right here. So let's see if it actually does that by doing console.log and then data from my form. And then we want to print out the form data in our console just to see how this constant is going to be changing when we make other changes. Now, just for the sake of convenience, I'm just going to get rid of some of the other console logs that I have in here as well. Otherwise, it will become a little bit messy in my console. So let's save this and go back to our front end. So we are now in our front end. And when I click on inspect and go to our console, you can see that the current data from my form is equal to nothing. But if I now open my model and I type something in the title, you can see that it is constantly changing and updating the form data. And also when I select something in my age, you can see that it's still doing the stuff correctly because it's changing the value of that constant based on my input. Now, the only thing that we also see right here for the date picker is that it's not doing that correctly. Because if I now select the 26th, you can see that it cannot destructure this property because it is undefined. And that is because these forms work a little bit differently than the other forms on top. So to make this work for our date picker form, we need to change the way that the value is being changed in the form. So we're going to be defining a new constant called handle date change. And then we say that the information we receive is called new date. And then we just do an arrow function in which we're going to provide the logic on how we should actually change the value of the date picker form. Now, we're still going to be using our onChange function that we have defined in the other file, but we just need to specify the value in a little bit of a different format. So what it actually wants to see is target, and then we do some colon, and then open some square brackets again. And there we can say that the name is going to be equal to name, because we want to pass in the name of the form as the first part of what we are going to be delivering. And then the value is actually not going to be the actual value that we have in the form, but we're going to format that by using day.js and then specify new date. Now what this is going to do, it is going to take a look at the value inside of our form and make it readable for our form because it needs to be in the right date format. And that is going to help us to actually print the correct values in our constant. Now what we need to do is then pass the handle change as the on change. When the form changes, it is going to take a look at the handle change, and then inside of the handle change, we're going to do a little bit of a different way to have the on change. So let's now see in practice what this actually does. We can see that day.js is not defined, which means that I did not import it. So let's go to the top of the file and do import day.js from day.js. And let's try again. And when I now click another day and I specify the 19th of June is the start, you can actually see that the value of start is now equal to M2. But if we take a closer look, you can see that there's actually date information specified right there. So now we can actually pass in the date that we would like inside of our form. Now the reason that I'm putting this form data and this set form data and also the handle change function inside of our calendar page is because we actually want to use information that is on this page to set a default value for some of the forms. Because what I want to do when I select the 5th of June, I want the start date and the end date to be defined as the 5th of June by default. And also when I close the form, I want to make sure that all of this is empty. And when I open the form, I want to see those default values again. And to actually realize that, we need to make a change to the handle open and the handle close functionality that we defined in the previous video. And that's the reason that everything comes together in this particular file. So the first thing what I want to do and what I just mentioned is that when we close the form, I actually want all of the data inside of that form to be equal to blank. So what I can do right here is go to the handle close function and just make sure that there are some squarely brackets included in the actual thing that we want to do there. And then next to the set open, we can also use the set form data function that we have on top right here to make sure that all of this is going to be empty. And to do that, we can actually just copy over the way that it is right there. And then in here, do some squarely brackets and state that every time that we close this form, we also want the form values to be equal to nothing. So let's now save this and see if that works. So if I now open one of these forms and I enter some data in here, and let's just make a few things right here. Previously, when I close this and open it again, it would have the same information. But now if I close it and I select another day, you can see that it is completely empty. So that is now working nicely. But I also want to use the date that is selected to populate the start and the end date of our form. So what we're going to do is copy over the set form data and add that to our handle open mechanism because we want to change the start and the end one and populate the correct date there. Now we already have that date available because we use set selected date to populate the correct date right here. So what we're also going to do here is set the start date equal to day.js, and we have already imported that in this file. And then set that we want to set the start date equal to info.datestring. And we also want to set the end date to the info.datestring. And now when we go back to our project and we select the 3rd of June, you can see that the start date and the end date are automatically set at the 3rd of June. And that is the whole reason why we have the form data and the handle change on this page, because over here it all comes together. So right now, if I select the 3rd of June, I can add a title of my appointment on June 3rd and then select in progress here. And I actually see that this label is not working correctly. So we're going to go back to my select form and make sure that age actually is taking a look at the label. And now it is correct again. And now if we inspect and we go to our console, you can see that we have the data all correctly in here. So the last thing that we need to do is make an actual submission. So let's do that right now. So our last step is actually submitting this data by using our Axios instance that we have defined previously. And we're going to be submitting from our model page because that's where we have the form tags and also the button. And as a last one, we also have already the form data available here. So we have everything that we need to submit that data. So first thing we need to do is import our Axios instance because that is the mechanism that is going to submit the data to our backend. And then we need to define the logic for submitting the data. In here, we're going to define a constant called submission. And then we say that it's going to be equal to event. And then do an arrow function with some squarely brackets. The first thing we're going to be adding is event.prevent default, and then some round brackets right there. And this means that we can prevent default behavior if we would like to. Then what we want to do is we want to define our Axios instance. And then we do dot post because we want to make a post request to the API that we've created earlier. Now, inside of these round brackets, we first need to define the URL that we need to post to. And that is equal to the appointments URL right there. So we can define that by doing some backwards commas and then say appointments, and we need to have a trailing slash like that. And then we can do a comma and some squarely brackets and define the data that we want to submit. And here the names need to be the same as what the backend expects. So that's going to be title, which is going to be equal to the form data.title. And the form data is actually the data from our form. Then the class names is going to be equal to form data.class names. And then for the start and the end date, we actually need to do something before we can put that in here, because we need to make a small change to the date format. So we can say a constant of start date is going to be equal to day.js and then form data.start. And then we need to put some square brackets like this and then define some parentheses and do a $sign and t, which is actually going to be referring to the data that we have submitted. And you can also see that in my console, if I select a date, that the actual string of the full data is available under the $sign d. So that's why we take $sign d. And then once we've taken the value from the $sign d, we're going to do dot format and put it in the format that our backend likes to receive. And that is year, month, day. And if we submit it like this, it should work just fine. And actually, I placed the round bracket wrong. The round bracket needs to be on the end of the D like that. Now we can copy over this whole thing and then define a constant called endDate. But then we just must make sure that it's form data.end that is going to be taking a look at and not the start. So then we can define in here that start is equal to start date and end is equal to that constant of end date. And just like that, we are submitting the right data. Now, of course, after we've submitted the data, we also want to reload the page because we want to immediately see the event on our calendar. So we can do .then, which is going to define what we need to do once we've submitted the data. And I'm going to put in res and then do an arrow function. So I'm going to console.log the data, which can be accessed through res. And actually, we made a small mistake right here as well, because this whole thing also needs to be in round brackets like this. And after we've console.log, I also want to reload the page to see the event on the calendar. So I do window.location.reload and then do some round brackets. And this should reload our full page and then show it on the calendar. Now we still need to trigger this submission to actually happen once we click the submit button. So what we can define inside of the form tags is say right here that on submit is going to be equal to submission. And this form is going to check if we've clicked the button with the type submit. And if that is the case, then it is going to do the submission, which should bring the data to the appointments backend and make it available there. And then by reloading the page, it should reflect that in our calendar. So let's now take a look if this whole thing works or we need to make some more changes. And as it turns out, we forgot one last import, and that is the import of day.js from day.js in our model9.jsx file. So if you include this one, then it should work just fine. And now we are back in our front end. And if I now select the 5th of June and I'm going to create a appointment for the 5th of June. And I can also give it a status of in progress and then say that it's from the 5th of June until the 5th of June. And I submit it. And we now see this appointment appearing in our calendar. And it will also work for the longer appointment. So if I create another one for 10 and I say appointment 10th of June and say that the status is completed and make sure that it is going to last until the 27th, then you can see that we can also generate the longer appointments right there. Now that is actually all for this video and this series. In this video, I showed you how you can click on the calendar and create events by using forms from Material UI and submit them through Axios. This was actually the last video in this series, but if you have any recommendations on other functionalities you would like to see from FullCalendar, let me know and I can always make more videos. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.